What's some of the common questions that we get on trying to troubleshoot a gauge, being a tack, being a water pressure or temperature, or knowing one of the sensors is out? We get this quite a bit. What's some of the common things that somebody can actually check to see, make sure their gauge is functioning correctly?
So first and foremost, when you turn the switches on to the gauge, does the gauge power up? Does it go to a full max position in case of a needle style gauge and then go back to zero? And then does the gauge just stay on? If the gauge does not stay on, it does its sweep and then goes back to zero and then shuts off, then in that case, it's typically some type of a wiring issue. So we don't have a brown wire connected correctly to tell the gauge to stay on, or it could be a bad ground. But there's some type of wiring issue if that happens. Now, if the gauge turns on, goes through its sweeps, goes back to zero, and immediately pegs, then that's typically an issue with the gauge. And one of the ways you can troubleshoot that is if you, for instance, have two pressure gauges in the car, simply disconnect the two pressure sensors and connect them to the other one and see if the gauge still does it. If the gauge still does it, or you can even disconnect the sensor. If the gauge still pegs, then we know that's the gauge that's got the issue and not the sensor itself. So you can switch the sensor back and forth to other sensors and see how that connects. That's probably one of the biggest ones. Now, the other one you run into is, the pressure sensor or the pressure gauge is not reading correctly. It's reading either half or reading either double of what it's supposed to. What you need to do there is look on the sensor itself. So right here on a wrench flat on those pressure sensors, there'll be a number inscribed on it. One will say 60 psi and the other one will say 127 psi. So in gauges that are 60 psi or lower, so like a 0 to 15 psi fuel pressure gauge or a 0 to 60 psi water pressure gauge, those gauges should all be on the 60 psi sensor. If you've got something mixed up and you put it on a 127, your pressures are going to be half of what they were. Vice versa, if you have an oil pressure gauge that say is 0 to 120, or a fuel pressure gauge that's 0 to 120, if you have it hooked to a sensor that says it's 60 psi, it's going to be double what it said it was. So making sure the right sensor is accompanied with the right gauge is very important. That's probably some of the biggest ones we run into as far as, running through troubleshooting for those. On the tacks, if you're running a standard MSD ignition and your RPMs are off, whether they be half or double or whatever may be the case, in most cases, you simply don't have the right number of cylinders selected in the setup of the gauge. The tacks, they all come set at a default with 8 cylinders. They all have a default maximum, like a pre-warning or a shift light, and then a extreme maximum set at like 8,500 and 9,000 RPM. So throughout your whole setup of the gauge that's in the instructions, if you don't select, or if you get the wrong number of cylinders selected, it can affect your RPM. Now, in cases of you're using, let's say, an HEI style distributor, it's like a stock style ignition. If the gauge if the tack is not reading correct, or if it's not stable, so the needle just jumps around, what you need to look at is first, put a tack filter in place. I highly recommend a tack filter on any style stock ignition, just to get a lot of the other noises out of the way of that style of ignition. In some cases, that doesn't fix the issue, and an HEI is very difficult to really tell what exactly is going on. If that's the case, then I would highly recommend calling some type of HEI manufacturer and talk to them about tack modules and ignition modules from them, and seeing if you can work something out as far as getting the tack smoothed up. HEIs are very, very difficult ones to diagnose some of the issues with. If you're running, let's say, a 600 or a midget or a micro, those are a little dependent on the types of of motorcycles or bikes the engines came off of. So, most of those are a 4-cylinder engine. In some manufacturers, they use a signal output for the RPM, 1 pulse per revolution. Some of it do it 1 pulse per cylinder fire. You just basically have to switch through, is it 1-cylinder, 2-cylinder, or 4-cylinder, and determine which pulse gets you the accurate RPM if you're not getting the accurate RPM. But that's really about the only thing you can do for those is either research and figure out how many pulses it's giving you per revolution, or just troubleshoot it by selecting 1, 2, or 4 and figuring out which cylinder, which frequency works the best.
On our tacks, how many cylinders could it work off of on these settings? You have it for a 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, 8 cylinders.
Yeah, as far as cylinders, we do a 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10 cylinder.
If you got any more questions, please go to longacreracing.com.